On this episode of Doin the Most, we are going to attempt to make sourdough bread with mead yeast.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
In the spirit of Reddit's recent mead bread fad, we are going to try and harvest yeast from this batch of lemongrass mead to use in bread. Now, the first part of this video is going to focus on yeast washing. If after that you're not really interested in watching the whole bread making experiment, jump forward to 1527 and I'll make sure to put that timestamp in the description. So the first thing we've got to do is rack the mead off of the gross lees and yeast cake. And this mead will likely be featured in an upcoming video, so please stay tuned for that. Including, I will save the tasting of this hopped lemongrass mead for that video. I'm going to walk you through the basics of yeast washing. Yeast washing can be used to salvage yeast from a batch, yeast that has grown and evolved and mutated as it has fermented your mead, and you can harvest that yeast off and use it in another batch. Now for this video, we're going to use that harvested yeast for a sourdough bread starter, but you could easily take this washed yeast, pitch it into your next batch of mead, and start brewing with it again. You can do this innumerable times, however, the yeast will mutate and evolve as it goes from batch to batch, so eventually you might get some undesirable results. So for yeast washing, we are going to start with 4 sanitized mason jars, and we're going to shake the lees up really strong so that way it's all mixed together, and divide it relatively evenly among these 4 jars. In that Dutch oven there is some water that had been brought to a boil and then allowed to cool to room temperature. We're going to top each of these jars up with some of that sanitary water, being careful to spill enough so that you can mop later, and then we'll seal each of those jars up, shake them so they're nice and well mixed, and then let them sit for 30 minutes. In this time lapse, you can actually see the gross lees start to settle to the bottom, and on top of that a thin white line forms. That is yeast starting to settle out, and so now we know that the water on top is yeasty water. That's where all the yeast are that we are going to harvest for our yeast washing. It is of note that you should be very careful and slow and deliberate as you are doing this process because you don't want to disturb the gross lees at the bottom. There's nothing really useful in there, so we don't want to harvest that off. We're just pouring that yeasty water from one jar into another sanitized jar and then stopping before we get to the gunk at the bottom. So 4 jars will eventually become 2 jars of yeasty water. And then those are going to go into the refrigerator and cold crash for 24 hours. And then we'll come back and pour the liquid off. So here we are 24 hours later. I have a nice hard cider, homemade. That cider update video is coming soon. And you can see the separation here, particularly the water on top, the yeast, and the lees. And then that other jar is almost entirely yeast at the bottom. So now, carefully again, we will pour off all of the water and discard that, and the yeast at the bottom is what we will use to ferment our batch. Now, I want to make a point here. You can do another cycle of washing here and very gently suction up the water with like a turkey baster, and then suction up the yeast from that, and then put that yeast into some more sanitary clean like spring water, shake it up real good, put that in the fridge and let it settle again, and then you will have even less lees carry over in your washed yeast from that jar. Now here, it's just going into a sourdough bread starter, so I'm not really worried about the mead flavors transferring over with that little tiny bit of lees that's in the bottom. And honestly, we're making mead bread, so if it tastes a little bit like the mead it came from, that's only a positive, right? So we're taking that yeast slurry and we are mixing it with a little bit of flour, trying to raise the volume of that up by about 1/3 to 1/2 with flour because there's still a lot of water in there. And what you're going for with a sourdough starter typically is kind of a pancake batter consistency. So we're going to seal that up loosely and let that sit for 24 hours. 24 hours later, you can see that it started to get kind of rich and spongy and foamy. that's a good thing. Now we're going to discard a couple tablespoons of that and then add in about a tablespoon of flour and a tablespoon of water. And then repeat this process every single day for 1 to 2 weeks. This is going to allow the yeast and bacteria colony to develop in there and create that souring effect. So here we are 2 weeks later, and I allowed this to sit an extra 24 hours so you could see some of the activity here. That hooch developed on top, and then the yeast is creating those CO2 bubbles that are pushing those little blobs up. So this is a very active starter. Now you could stir that hooch in to give it a little bit more of an acidic flavor in your sourdough if you prefer your sourdough more sour, but I am going to dump that off and discard it. And then we're gonna build the sourdough starter up more for our loaf. And this is the part where I will caution you that this whole process is experimental. I decided I would bake 4 loaves out of this, tweaking things here and there, because I don't typically make like a regular style sourdough anyway. I make sourdough sandwich bread, which is a totally different process. So I made enough dough here that I could make several loaves and fail a few times on my way to the finish line. So to build up my starter for our sourdough dough, I am adding equal parts water and flour to the starter that I poured off, and then we'll cover it with some plastic wrap and let that sit overnight so we can reassess the next day. 24 hours later, it started to get real goopy and bubbly again, so we are in business. We are going to build it up a little bit more before we bake our bread. So just refresh it with another equal parts water and flour, and that gets the yeast a little bit activated again, gives them some more food to work on, and gets our starter nice and ready to be incorporated into the sourdough dough. Dough. So we'll cover that and leave it an hour, and an hour later it's nice and spongy, just exactly what we want. So now we need to do a step called autolyse, and that is essentially just mixing up your flour and your water. Again, I'm using equal parts for this. Now the flour is 50% bread flour and 50% whole wheat flour, and then the water is just water. So we're mixing the flour and water in equal proportions, so just as much flour as you have water. For simplicity's sake on both of these, I'm trying to hit 1,000 grams. And then we're gonna mix those together and allow that to sit for about an hour. And autolyse is basically like a process that's designed to help generate more gluten in your final dough. And so it's a good step to follow to just like let your dough grow into its own. So that's gonna be covered with plastic wrap and allowed to sit for an hour. And then an hour later, we are ready to actually make dough. Now I did a lot of Googling trying to develop this mead bread process, and it seemed like most recipes involve some form of mixing your sourdough starter in with your dough at a rate of 1 to 5. That is 5 parts dough for every 1 part sourdough starter. So for simplicity's sake, that's what I'm doing here. And since I used 1,000 grams of water and 1,000 grams of flour, it was pretty easy to measure out 1,000 grams of dough. And so I will be adding to that about 200 grams of starter. But if you're doing this at home, just keep in mind a 1 to 5 starter to dough proportion, and you'll nail the proportions fairly easily. So take a sip of some barley wine bochet, and then we are going to pinch and fold our starter into our dough to get it nice and mixed up. And you can see that the gluten has formed really well here. It stretches very nicely, and it is a very loose dough. Now we're gonna do this weird thing that I saw on several recipes and YouTube videos where we slap it on the bench for 5 minutes. And this is supposed to help incorporate the liquid into the flour. And you should go from a liquidy dough to a more stretchy dough by the time you're done with this. And it was quite a workout. 5 minutes later, we are going to slap our dough into a baking dish that has been greased with olive oil. I was listening to Queen here, so I've got a little bit of a groove on as I try and release that from my hands. And this, like I said, this dough was very loose, but I was assured that this was a good thing. So we are repeating that with the other half of our dough. And as you can see here with this starter, it is very stretchy. It looks like I'm pouring it out, but literally it's just hanging off the lip of the bowl. I gave that to a coworker so she can try and make her own sourdough, so shout out to Carrie. I hope that's going well for you. So, mixing it in, pinching it together, checking the camera, and slap, slap, slap. So here's our dough. Now every 30 minutes for 3 hours, you are going to stretch and fold it just a little bit. Here is my last stretching and folding of that 3 hours. I didn't want to bother you with the rest of it. I'm also adding salt, that's about 2 teaspoons, and it equates to about 2% or so of your bread dough. But I like my bread less salty, so your mileage may vary. So as you can see, I'm just stretching it and folding it on itself. And like I said, that happens every 30 minutes for 3 hours as your dough is kind of in this bulk ferment stage. So this is the part where the experiment started to go off the rails. Everything I was reading and watching was talking about just how much flour you're going to need to add to this. So I put a lot of flour on the bench, just hoping to get this to come together enough that I could cut it. Because each of these dough masses needs to be split into 2 dough balls. And so it kind of went off the rails with not just how much flour that I floured the bench with, but how much flour I had been encouraged to put into the colanders as this bread proofs for another 24 hours. And you'll see this here in a bit as I show you the 2 major fail loaves that were made out of this experiment. So what we're doing here is pre-shaping it, and then we're going to let that rest on the bench under some towels for about 10 minutes before we place it into a colander lined with fabric and heavily floured. Now, heavily floured is not the recommendation I would make. That is the recommendation that the internet made. I think a pretty casual flouring of the cloth would be fine. Here I am adding way the heck too much flour to this and then doing another shaping, just pinching it over on itself and closing the seam, and then placing that seam side up into the basket. And you can see it was still sticking to my hands. Repeat with the other loaf, and then repeat with the 2 remaining loaves. So here's all 4 loaves, all in their glory, and those are gonna sit for 24 hours before we pour ourselves a glass of Skeeter Pea, which is a lemonade wine, and dive in to baking all of these loaves. So again, the internet insisted that there be a lot more flour on the bottom of the loaf. So I floured it, I turned it out, and you can see how sad this thing looks already, and I haven't even uncovered it. Try as you might to release it from the cloth, and then you're gonna cut the excess parchment away, giving you just a circle of parchment paper under the bottom of it. Now this is a screaming hot Dutch oven, which was at about 450 degrees, and I placed it into the Dutch oven directly, covered it, and baked it for 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, I rotated it and removed the lid, and then baked for another 30. I did essentially the same process for the second loaf, but I made some decorative cuts to the top, and this is how they came out. It looks pretty unappetizing. On the inside it looked fine, but there was just too much excess flour on the outside, and I feel like the internet led me astray there. But the inside was fine. That said, I didn't taste them, didn't even try them. They went out for the birds. So we can improve. What I decided to do was reshape the dough ball one more time and let that sit for another half an hour, and then I turned it out again. That gives us a much more round and clean loaf, and some of that excess flour got folded into it. I made some more decorative cuts on this one and removed the excess parchment into the screaming hot Dutch oven, covered, baked for 15, uncovered, and then baked for another 30. And this one came out beautiful. Just a nice little round plump loaf that looks like real freaking sourdough. So at this point, I was excited. I had figured it out. It needed a second shaping before baking. And this is the other loaf that I made. Now there are some veins of cooked flour running through them. It didn't seem to affect the flavor or texture any, but it is kind of a weird look for sourdough. And they turned out pretty good. Nice and spongy, cut well, looks great. So here now are your condensed steps to make sourdough bread from mead lees. Step 1, rack off your mead, leaving only the yeast cake behind. Step 2, wash your yeast. Step 3, use said yeast to build up a sourdough starter with flour. Step 4, feed your starter every day, discarding a little bit of it as you go. Do this for 1 to 2 weeks. Step 5, using that sourdough starter, build up an even bigger starter before you make your dough, using equal parts water and flour and your sourdough starter. Starter should become thick and spongy. Step 6, mix up your flour and water for autolyse, using equal parts flour and water. Step 7, mix your sourdough starter into your sourdough dough at a rate of 1 parts sourdough starter to 5 parts bread dough. Step 8, slap it around for 5 minutes. Step 9, place dough in an oiled baking container and fold every 30 minutes for 3 hours. Step 10, flour your bench and pre-shape your dough. Rest for 10 minutes. Step 11, shape dough, place in a colander lined with cloth and lightly floured, and sit 24 hours. Step 12, turn out and reshape dough ball. Step 13, place back in colander and let sit for 30 minutes. Step 14, turn out dough ball. Step 15, make decorative cuts on top and remove excess parchment paper. Step 16, place into a screaming hot Dutch oven, cover, and bake at 350 degrees for 15 minutes. Uncover, rotate, and bake another 30 minutes. Step 17, you're done. In the end, this sourdough was a real freaking pain in the butt, and I would not repeat this process, but it made an okay sourdough loaf, nice and spongy, good grain flavor, and my coworkers basically ate it all or took it away over the course of a day. Now, I think a traditional sourdough is a smarter way to go. I can't taste the meat in this. I think yeast washing is a great lesson that can be learned from this video, though, in how to harvest your yeast and create your own yeast strain, your own yeast brand. But making sourdough from mead yeast is just kind of a novelty, in my opinion. But we did it, we succeeded at it, and we'll probably never do it again. Thank you for watching. As always, check us out at dointhemost.org or follow us on Instagram and Pinterest at dointhemostok. And I apologize for the length of this video. Hopefully we'll have something a little more interesting for you next time. But thanks for following along.